The cruiser floated alone in the silence of space. Its hull was cracked, its weapons rusted, and its name almost forgotten. Once, long ago, this ship had been a weapon of terror. Entire fleets had run at the sight of it, and entire worlds had, bent to the power it carried. But time had changed everything. Empires rose and fell, and when this cruiser was finally beaten in a distant war, no one cared to repair it. The crew abandoned it. The empire it served discarded it like broken metal. For years it drifted at the edge of a system no one visited, turning slowly under the light of a pale star, waiting for nothing. Kellen Ward was not the kind of man who saw nothing. He was human, and humans had a strange way of looking at the world. Where most species looked at a ruin and thought waste, humans thought possibility. Kellen was a scavenger by trade. He had spent years moving from one junk field to another, searching for parts that could be sold for scraps. His ship was small, weak, and always close to breaking down. He had no army behind him, no crew to follow his orders, no family waiting on a homeworld. What he had was stubbornness, and in the vastness of space, sometimes that was enough. When Kellen's scanners first caught the shadow of the cruiser, he thought it was just another wreck. His first instinct was to mark the coordinates and sell the location to someone with deeper pockets. But something about the shape caught his eye. Even damaged and broken, the cruiser had a kind of dignity, as if it refused to die. Its long lines still carried the design of strength, and its towers still looked like they were reaching for the stars. Most people would never dare approach such a ruin. Stories were told of broken reactors, leftover traps, and dead ships filled with ghosts of their crews. Kellen didn't believe in ghosts, at least not the kind that haunted corridors. He believed in the ghosts of forgotten dreams. And this ship was one. He brought his shuttle in carefully, guiding it along the cruiser's torn hull. The closer he got, the more the scars became clear. Whole sections of armor had been burned away. Turrets hung broken, some twisted as if they had melted under great fire. The engines were dark, the great nozzles coated in layers of dust and frozen debris. The airlocks were sealed, but most of the seals had long since failed. He docked with steady hands, knowing that if his shuttle took one wrong bump against the metal giant, he could be left drifting with no way home. When the airlock opened, the smell of old metal and burnt wiring hit him first. He pulled out a light and stepped into the silent hallway. Dust floated in the air like frozen snow. The walls were blackened with fire scars, and loose wires hung like vines. His boots echoed against the metal floor, the sound far too loud in the silence. Kellen knew that to most people this place would feel like a tomb. To him it felt like a challenge. He moved deeper, marking each path on his wrist console so he would not get lost. The cruiser was huge, easily 100 times the size of his shuttle. He passed rooms that once must have been filled with alien soldiers, now nothing but broken bunks and shattered tables. He crossed through a wide hall lined with cracked viewing windows, where once commanders had looked out at their fleet. Now the only view was the emptiness of stars. Every step reminded him that this ship was not just metal. It was history, abandoned and left to die. And Kellen could not stand the thought of letting it fade. When he reached the heart of the ship, the main reactor chamber, he stopped and stared for a long time. The core was silent, cold as stone, but the framework was still there. The power conduits were broken, but not gone. The main reactor casing was cracked, but not beyond repair. Anyone else would have walked away, knowing the effort would take years and that no sane man could do it alone. But Kellen was not anyone else. He placed his hand on the cold surface of the reactor and felt the weight of it. In that moment, he made a decision. He would bring the ship back to life. He knew it would not be easy. He knew every alien mechanic, and every salvager would laugh at him if they heard of his plan. They would say it was impossible. But humans had always been told something was impossible, and humans had always found ways to prove the universe wrong. Kellen's eyes narrowed as he imagined the cruiser shining again, its engines burning across the stars. The thought made his heart race. As he walked back through the dark halls, his light flashing across ruined walls, he already began planning. He would need to strip his own shuttle for parts. He would need to trade everything he owned for tools and supplies. He might even need to risk stealing from junkyards and black markets. But the ship was worth it. The galaxy had abandoned it, but Kellen Ward would not. He could see what no one else could see. That inside the rust and ruin, there was still a legend waiting to wake, and he had just sworn to make it breathe again. Kellen returned to the cruiser every day, carrying what little he could bring from his shuttle. His small craft was barely holding together, but it became his lifeline. He pulled spare wires from its panels, unscrewed parts from the engine that were not vital, and even stripped pieces of his living quarters until his shuttle was little more than a hollow shell. Every bolt, every strip of metal, and every tool he owned found its way into the cruiser. He gave without hesitation because he knew the little ship he lived in was temporary, but the cruiser could become something greater. The work was brutal. He started with the power systems because without light or heat, the ship was nothing but a tomb. He dragged coils of wire down long corridors, patching connections one by one. Many times sparks flew into his face, and more than once he thought he had blown the entire system for good. But after weeks of work, a faint hum echoed through the cruiser for the first time in decades. Lights flickered weakly across the walls, dim and uneven, but alive. Kellen sat on the cold floor that night, his face lit by a single working lamp, and laughed like a madman. The ship had taken its first breath. Not everything went smoothly. The reactor was the heart of the ship, but it was cracked and unstable. Kellen had no advanced tools to fix it. He used makeshift welds, repurposed plating, and even melted down scraps from his shuttle to seal gaps. It was dangerous work. The alien technology was not designed for human hands, and more than once the reactor spat sparks that nearly set him on fire. His gloves burned, his arms carried new scars, but he did not stop. Each time he returned to the chamber, he felt as if the ship itself was watching him, daring him to give up. He never did. The days blurred together. Kellen slept in a small corner of the cruiser where he set up a thin bedroll and a heater salvaged from his shuttle. The sound of dripping pipes and the distant groan of metal became his lullaby. Food was simple, stored rations he had collected. Over months, but he ate without complaint. Every waking hour was devoted to the ship. He mapped its halls carefully, noting which sections were too damaged to use and which might be restored. The cruiser was far larger than he first believed, with dozens of decks and chambers built for a crew of thousands. Now he was one man, trying to replace them all. Word began to spread. Traders passing through the system caught sight of the human's small shuttle docked to the great ruin. They carried tales to nearby stations, and soon everyone knew. A lone human was trying to repair a fallen war cruiser. Most found it hilarious. At docking bays and cantinas, alien engineers laughed openly at the story. A human cannot even fix a single plasma coil, let alone a warship, they said. Some even wagered how long he would last before he starved or the ship's systems killed him. Kellen heard their words when he traveled to markets for supplies. He saw the smirks, the pity, and the disbelief in their eyes. But he did not argue. He simply bought what he needed and returned to the cruiser. Inside the ship, their voices faded. Here it was just him in the silence, broken only by the sounds of his work. Slowly, the ship began to change. Corridors that were once pitch black glowed faintly. A single engine, long dead, coughed and roared weakly for a moment before shutting down again. It was progress, and progress kept him alive. Kellen began to talk to the ship as he worked, his voice echoing in the vast halls. "You're not finished yet," he would say. "They left you for dead, but we're going to prove them wrong." One night, as he checked the systems from the control deck, he managed to bring a small portion of the ship's interface back online. The screens lit up with alien symbols, their language unreadable, but the glowing letters filled the dark chamber with light. For the first time, the cruiser seemed to answer him. He touched the screen and smiled. It felt like shaking, hands with an old warrior waking from a long sleep. But with progress came new dangers. The power he managed to restore lit the ship like a beacon. Pirates in nearby sectors noticed the strange activity. Rumors reached their ears that the dead cruiser was stirring again, and they grew interested. To scavengers and raiders, the ship was not a legend, it was scrap worth fortunes if torn apart. Kellen did not know it yet, but his work was already drawing eyes. For now, he pushed forward, unaware of what was coming. His hands bled, his tools broke, and his supplies dwindled. But his spirit did not falter. He had found something worth more than profit, something worth more than survival. The galaxy had left this cruiser to rot, but Kellen Ward had chosen to believe in it. And belief, he thought, was sometimes the strongest fuel of all. The months passed, and Kellen's work on the cruiser became his entire life. He no longer thought of himself as a scavenger who stumbled onto a wreck. He thought of himself as a builder, someone chosen to give the ship a second chance. Each day began with the same ritual: checking the reactor, testing the power flow, and then crawling through broken corridors with tools strapped to his belt. The cruiser resisted him at every step. Entire sections of the ship were so heavily damaged that they seemed beyond repair. He would weld a wall shut one day only to find it had buckled under its own weight the next. He would spend hours connecting a power line, then discover the current fried the circuit because of hidden corrosion. Yet for every failure, there was a small success. A dim light that stayed on. A door that opened smoothly. A panel that responded when he touched it. These moments kept him going. When he traveled to nearby stations for supplies, the laughter grew louder. Alien engineers gathered in groups, pointing and smirking when he entered the shops. They mocked his human stubbornness and told stories about how he was wasting his life on a ship that could never fly again. The cruiser is cursed, they said. Its own builders abandoned it. What makes a human think he can do better? Kellen never argued. He kept his eyes down, bought what he needed and left. But inside, their words burned. He didn't want to prove them wrong for pride. He wanted to prove them wrong because deep in his heart, he knew the ship deserved more than to be forgotten. He couldn't explain why he felt this way, only that he did. One evening, after weeks of work, Kellen managed to power up one of the main engines. The roar shook the entire vessel, rattling dust from the ceilings and filling the halls with vibrations. For a brief moment, he thought the ship might tear itself apart, but the engine stabilized, humming like a giant waking from a long sleep. Kellen stood there, his hands trembling, eyes wide. He had done it. The cruiser was no longer dead metal. It had begun to breathe again. The sound carried farther than he knew. Out in the system, small ships picked up the energy surge. A few traders saw the glow of the engines as they tested, and the story spread faster than before. The lonely human had done something impossible. He had brought part of the cruiser back, to life. And with that story came more attention, not just from engineers and traders, but from those who lived by preying on others. Pirates began to circle the system. They spoke of easy plunder, of tearing the human's prize apart before it could become dangerous. To them it was simple. One man could not hold a cruiser, but they underestimated the human stubbornness that had already carried Kellen this far. Kellen sensed the danger before it arrived. When he returned from one of his supply runs, he found strange markings on the hull of the cruiser. Scavenger. Probes had scraped across its surface, testing its defenses. He knew what that meant. Someone was watching. His hands tightened into fists. He had brought the ship this far, and he wasn't about to lose it now. He worked harder than ever, focusing on the ship's defense systems. Most of the weapons were useless, broken beyond his skill to repair, but he found ways to make a few of them function. He cannibalized alien circuits, rewired control panels with human tools, and tested the firing mechanisms until his ears rang from the sound. The weapons were far from perfect, but they were better than nothing. Nights grew colder and lonelier. Kellen sat in the control deck staring at the faint lights on the panels. Sometimes he felt the weight of it pressing down on him. The size of the cruiser, the endless repairs, the certainty that enemies were watching. He could almost hear the laughter of the engineers in his head. But then he would look at the glowing engine readouts or hear the low hum of power flowing through the ship, and his resolve returned. He began to feel something strange, something he had never expected. It was as if the ship itself was with him, When he walked through the halls no longer completely dark, he felt like the cruiser was listening. When he worked on the reactor, he felt like it was pushing back but also guiding him. He knew it was only his imagination, but it gave him strength. Perhaps the ship did not want to die, and perhaps he was simply the man stubborn enough to hear its silent call. The mockery outside the system did not matter anymore. The pirates gathering on the edges did not scare him. Kellen Ward had taken a wreck that no one wanted and turned it into something alive again. And deep in his chest he felt a fire he had not known before. The cruiser was not yet whole. It was still fragile, still wounded, and still far from its old power. But it was his, and he was not about to let anyone take it away. Kellen woke one morning to the sound of alarms echoing faintly through the cruiser. He had restored only a small part of the ship's systems, but the sensors had just enough power to warn him when something approached. He rushed to the control deck, his boots clanging on the metal floor, and stared at the old display screens. The signals were faint but clear. Ships were moving into the system. He leaned forward, his breath caught in his chest. The readings showed 3 small craft circling closer, the kind of ships pirates used when hunting. He had expected this day. Ever since the engine had roared back to life, he knew the light would draw unwanted eyes. Now the predators had arrived. Kellen checked his defenses. The cruiser had once carried enough weapons to destroy entire fleets, but now only a handful of cannons worked. Even those were unstable. He had tested one the week before and nearly burned out the firing system. Still, they were all he had. He whispered to the ship as if it could hear him. "We can do this. Just hold together." Hours passed before the pirates made their move. Their ship slid closer like wolves circling wounded prey. Through the cracked windows of the command deck, Kellen saw their faint lights in the distance. He could almost feel their confidence. To them, he was just a man hiding inside a broken relic. But Kellen was not hiding. He had rebuilt this cruiser with his blood and sweat. He was ready to fight for it. When the first pirate ship fired, the blast shook the cruiser's outer hull. Alarms rang. Kellen gritted his teeth, slammed his hand onto the firing controls, and one of the old cannons spat fire into the void. The shot was clumsy, but it hit. The pirates' shield cracked and their ship spun away, smoking. Kellen shouted with triumph. For the first time, the cruiser had answered an attack. The other 2 pirates did not back away. They pressed in closer, firing again and again. The cruiser shuddered under the blows, and Kellen feared the fragile repairs would give way. Sparks flew from panels around him, filling the control deck with smoke. He coughed, blinking through the haze, and adjusted the power lines. Another cannon roared, streaking light across the dark. This time the shot missed, but the pirates scattered, realizing the human ship still had teeth. The fight dragged on for hours. Kellen felt every strike like a wound in his own body. His arms shook from exhaustion as he ran between control panels, rerouting energy, forcing broken systems to work. Sweat poured down his face, but his eyes burned with determination. Each time he thought the ship would collapse, it steadied itself, as if refusing to give up. The pirates grew frustrated. What they expected to be an easy raid had turned into a costly battle. Finally, one of their ships exploded under the cruiser's fire, scattering debris into the void. The last pirate fled, engines blazing, unwilling to lose everything to a single stubborn human. Silence fell again. Kellen leaned against the control chair, his chest heaving, his face streaked with grime. The cruiser was damaged, its hull scarred, with new burns, but it had survived. More than that, it had fought back. Kellen smiled through his exhaustion. He placed a hand on the nearest console and whispered, "You're not just alive. You're dangerous again." News of the battle spread quickly. Traders who had witnessed the flashes of the fight carried the story across stations and colonies. People laughed less when they spoke of the human now. They whispered instead. They called him mad, but no longer dismissed him as a fool. If a single man could bring a dead cruiser back to life and use it to defeat pirates, perhaps there was something more to this legend in the making. Kellen did not think of himself as a legend. He thought only of the work ahead. The fight had proved the cruiser was not ready. Too many systems failed during the battle, and too many weapons had been silent when he needed them. If stronger enemies came, he might not survive. That thought did not frighten him, it motivated him. He knew he had no choice but to push harder. The days after the battle were filled with endless repairs. He welded plates across the damaged hull, rerouted power to stabilize the reactor, and even managed to bring 2 more cannons online. His body ached constantly, his hands were blistered and raw, but he felt alive in a way he had never known before. He was not just surviving in the galaxy anymore, he was building something greater. At night, when he lay in his small corner of the cruiser, he thought about the life he had left behind. The wandering, the endless search for scraps, the empty trade stations. None of that mattered now. This ship had given him purpose, and he had given it his promise. He would not abandon it as others had. Together they would rise again, and somewhere, in the dark of space, he knew others were already watching, waiting for him to fail. He almost smiled at the thought. Let them come. He had already faced worse than their doubt. He had faced silence, ruin, and despair. Now, with the cruiser at his side, he would face the galaxy itself if he had to. The pirate attack had changed everything. Kellen no longer worked in silence, hidden away in the shadows of the forgotten system. Now the galaxy was beginning to take notice. Traders whispered his name in docking bays. Some called him mad, others called him reckless. But many spoke with wonder, because stories of the lone human and his reborn cruiser carried a power of their own. For Kellen, the attention was a burden he could not ignore. Each day he worked harder, knowing another attack could come at any moment. The pirates had been a test, but they would not be the last. He could almost feel the eyes of the galaxy pressing on him, waiting to see if the man in the ship would rise or fall. He poured every waking hour into the cruiser. The engines that had once only sputtered now roared with new life after weeks of endless adjustments. He scavenged deeper into the vessel, uncovering weapon bays he had not yet touched. Some were hopeless, their systems melted or stripped bare, long ago, but others showed promise. By patching alien technology with human parts, he made them usable again. His hands never stopped moving, even when exhaustion weighed him down. There were times when frustration almost crushed him. A whole week's worth of repairs could vanish in a single spark of failure. Circuits would overload, welds would snap, and panels would collapse after he thought they were fixed. On those nights, he sat in the control deck staring at the dead screens, fighting the temptation to give up. But then he would remember the look of the pirates fleeing, the glow of the engine he had brought to life, and the laughter of those who said he would fail. Those memories pushed him back to his feet every time, and slowly the cruiser began to transform. Its halls no longer echoed only with emptiness. Lights stayed on, soft but steady. Doors opened with a hiss instead of grinding in protest. The control deck began to feel less like a grave and more like a command center again. Kellen often walked the corridors and imagined the ship as it once was, alive with thousands of crew bristling with power. Now, though, it was his. Not the Empire's. Not the pirates'. His. The change in the ship was matched by the change in the galaxy's opinion. No one laughed openly anymore. Engineers who once mocked the idea now argued in stations about how the human had managed to repair systems they thought impossible to fix. Some even traveled near the system, hoping to catch a glimpse of the cruiser in action. Rumors spread faster than truth, and already people spoke of the ship as if it were a ghost reborn, a weapon that should have stayed dead but refused to stay buried. Kellen heard some of these whispers when he traveled for supplies. He kept his head down, but the looks he received were different now. Some were cautious, even fearful. Others were filled with respect. He did not care much for either. Respect and fear were only distractions. What mattered was that he was not done yet. The cruiser was alive, yes, but it was not ready. It needed more time, more work, more of everything. His determination was tested again sooner than he expected. Not long after the pirate battle, a new fleet entered the system. Larger, more organized, and far more dangerous. They were not pirates. This time, they were privateers, soldiers for hire, paid by someone who wanted the cruiser for themselves. The first time Kellen saw their ships on the scanners, his stomach tightened. There were 5 of them, sleek and fast, built for war. He could have fled. The engines were strong enough now to move the cruiser out of the system, though not far. But running was not in him. He had chosen this ship, and he would stand with it. He strapped himself into the command chair, his fingers flying across the controls he had rebuilt with his own hands. "Let's show them," he whispered to the ship. The battle that followed was nothing like the skirmish with the pirates. The privateers struck hard and fast, their weapons pounding against the cruiser's hull. Alarms screamed across the decks. Panels blew apart in showers of sparks. The ship groaned like a wounded beast. But Kellen refused to surrender. He fired back, every cannon he had managed to restore spitting flame into the void. The shots were not precise, but they were powerful. 2 of the enemy ships faltered under the assault, their shields cracking, their captains shocked that the old cruiser could still fight. Kellen felt alive in the chaos. His blood raced, his muscles burned, and yet he had never been more focused. Each moment was a choice between survival and destruction. He rerouted power through broken conduits, forced failing weapons to fire, and pushed the engines beyond their limits. The ship answered him like it had been waiting for this moment. Together, they turned the tide. When the last enemy fled into the black trailing smoke and sparks, the cruiser was scarred and battered but victorious. Kellen slumped in his chair, exhausted beyond words, but a grin spread across his face. Twice now the galaxy had tried to take the ship from him. Twice it had failed. By the time word of the battle spread, Kellen and the cruiser were no longer seen as a joke. They were seen as a threat. And somewhere in the halls of power, the empire that had once abandoned the ship finally began to take notice. The empire that once owned the cruiser could no longer pretend it was gone. At first, they ignored the rumors. To them, the ship had been a failure, a painful reminder of a war they wished to forget. But when news arrived of pirates destroyed and privateer fleets beaten back, the empire's leaders began to worry. The vessel they had abandoned was alive again, and worse, it was under the command of a human, one of the youngest species in the galaxy, a race known more for stubbornness than power. Kellen did not know all the details, but he could feel the weight of their attention. The attacks he had survived were not random. Someone was sending them, and it was only a matter of time before greater forces arrived. He worked harder than ever, driven by the knowledge that he was no longer repairing a forgotten wreck. He was preparing for war. The cruiser bore scars from every battle, but each scar told a story. Kellen reinforced the hull with plating scavenged from wrecked ships, patched holes with melted alloys, and strengthened the reactor until its hum filled every corridor. He brought more weapons online, not perfect but functional, and rigged systems so they could be operated by a single man. He slept less and less, his body running on sheer will. To him, the ship was no longer just a machine. It was a companion, a partner, a legend he was shaping with his own hands. Word spread far beyond the stations and trade routes now. Colonists whispered about him in awe. Small settlements that had long been ignored by the Empire began to see hope in the story of the human in the cruiser. They imagined the ship not as a threat but as a shield. If one man could take what the Empire had thrown away and turn it into something greater, perhaps they too could rise against the chains that bound them. Kellen began to notice this shift. When he traveled for supplies, strangers approached him, quietly, slipping him spare parts, food, or tools without asking for payment. Their eyes carried respect, even gratitude. He did not know what to say to them. He was not fighting for them, not yet. He was fighting for the ship and for himself. But part of him began to realize the truth. He was no longer alone in this. The legend of the reborn cruiser was already larger than him. One evening, as he sat in the control deck staring at the faint glow of the displays, a message broke through the static of the ship's ancient comm system. The words were alien, sharp, and cold, but the meaning was clear. The Empire demanded the return of the cruiser. They called it stolen property. They claimed Kellen had no right to it, no right to change what they had created. Kellen listened in silence. his hands clenched into fists, his jaw tight. They had abandoned the ship. They had left it to rot in the dark. They had let it drift until it was nothing but dust and memory. And now, when it lived again, they wanted to take it from him. His answer was simple. He powered up the engines, sent no reply, and let the roar of the ship's heart speak for him. The Empire's demand was not just a warning. It was the start of a storm. Scouts began to appear at the edge of the system, their sleek ships watching from a distance before vanishing back into the dark. Kellen knew they were measuring him, testing his strength. Soon they would come in force. He felt no fear. Instead, he felt a fire burn brighter in his chest. He had given everything to the cruiser, and it had given him back purpose. He would not surrender it. The days that followed were filled with preparation. Kellen reinforced defenses, reprogrammed targeting systems, and stored every bit of fuel and food he could find. He trained himself to react faster, to work the controls with precision. The ship had once needed thousands of crew, but now it relied on one human's hands. It should have been impossible, but impossibility had never stopped him before. Sometimes, when exhaustion weighed on him, Kellen stood in the great halls of the cruiser and let the silence speak. He imagined the voices of the crew that once walked there, the echo of boots on the floor, the commands shouted in battle. Now there was only him. But he did not feel small. He felt part of something far larger, a story that stretched beyond his own life. The Empire believed they could take back what was theirs. They believed one man could not stand against them. Kellen Ward was ready to prove them wrong. The cruiser, once forgotten, had become more than a ship. It was a symbol, a reminder that nothing truly dies if someone is willing to fight for it. As the stars outside flickered and the sensors warned of new ships entering the system, Kellen tightened his grip on the controls. His heart pounded, but his voice was steady as he whispered to the ship, "We're not theirs anymore. We never will be. Let's show them who we are." And the cruiser answered with the deep, steady hum of power, as if it agreed. The Empire came in force. This time there were no pirates, no mercenaries, no scattered raiders. This time it was a fleet, proud ships flying the banners of a power that had ruled stars for centuries. Their warships cut through space with precision, engines burning bright, weapons fully charged. The message was clear. The Empire had come to take back what they believed was theirs. Kellen sat in the command chair of the cruiser, watching the scanner as red marks filled the screen one by one. He felt the weight of the moment press down on him. For years, the ship had been silent, abandoned and forgotten. Now the Empire remembered, and they wanted to erase the proof of their failure. To them, Kellen was just a thief clinging to broken metal. To him, the cruiser was everything. He ran his hands over the control panels, steady and sure. The ship hummed beneath him, stronger than ever. The engines thrummed with power, the reactor steady, the weapons waiting for his command. He whispered under his breath, not for anyone to hear, but for the ship itself. "We've come too far to stop now. Let's show them what a legend looks like." The fleet opened fire first. Blazing light streaked across the void, smashing into the cruiser's shields. The hull shook, alarms screamed, but the ship held together. Kellen gritted his teeth and fired back. Cannons roared, beams tore through the dark, and one enemy vessel spun out of formation, crippled from the first volley. The battle had begun. The Empire's ships were faster, their crews trained, their weapons flawless. But the cruiser had something they did not, a human at the helm who refused to quit. Kellen fought with everything he had, pushing the ship beyond its limits. He rerouted power again and again, forcing systems to work long past their design. Sparks rained down from broken panels. Smoke filled the air, but he did not stop. His hands flew across controls, his voice steady as he spoke to himself and to the ship. The battle raged on. Enemy ships circled, unleashing wave after wave of fire. Each strike scarred the cruiser, tearing at the hull, shaking the decks. But the ship answered every attack with fury. Its weapons, once silent, blazed to life, cutting through shields and armor. For every wound it took, it gave back twice the pain. The Empire had expected to crush a relic. Instead, they faced a warrior reborn. Kellen felt every moment as if the ship were part of him. When the hull shuddered, he clenched his teeth. When the cannons fired, his heart surged. He had become one with the vessel, and together they were more than a man and a machine. They were defiance made real. One by one, the Empire's ships began to falter. A frigate broke apart under a broadside volley. Another spun out of control, engines burning, before vanishing into the void. Still more pressed in, determined to end what they saw as an insult to their pride. Kellen's arms shook from exhaustion, sweat stung his eyes, but he would not let go. Every move, every shot, every desperate gamble was fueled by the fire inside him. Finally, after hours of brutal fighting, the last of the fleet broke. What remained of the Empire's ships fled, their captains unwilling to waste more lives against what should have been impossible. The cruiser, scarred and burning but unbroken, drifted alone in the silence that followed. Kellen slumped back in the chair, his chest heaving, his body aching with exhaustion. The ship was alive. Against all odds, it had survived the storm. He laughed, the sound raw and tired but filled with triumph. He placed his hand on the console, the metal warm beneath his fingers. "We did it," he whispered. "They'll never forget us now." Word of the battle spread faster than light. Traders carried the story to every corner of the galaxy. Colonists cheered, rebels raised their heads, and even the Empire's citizens whispered in secret about the human who had turned their discarded warship into a legend. The cruiser was no longer just a ship. It was a symbol. A reminder that strength did not come from empires or fleets, but from will. Kellen did not see himself as a hero. He saw himself as a man who refused to give up, who found life in what others had thrown away. Yet in every station, every colony, his name was spoken with respect. Some called him mad, others called him brave, but all agreed he had done the impossible. The cruiser drifted quietly now, patched together but alive. Its scars told the story of battles won and futures waiting. Kellen stood in its vast halls, empty but no longer silent, and felt the weight of history around him. He knew the Empire would return one day, stronger and angrier. He knew more battles lay ahead. But he was ready. For now, the galaxy had a new legend. A ship left to rot, reborn by human hands. A man who would not abandon it. Together they would roam the stars, not as a relic of the past, but as a promise of what persistence could achieve. And so, in the quiet after the storm, the human and the cruiser began their true journey, not as forgotten ruins, but as symbols of hope and defiance, a legend whispered in every corner of the galaxy.